Organizations worldwide are rapidly deploying AI, recognizing its potential to enhance competitiveness across various sectors. However, this widespread adoption brings with it a complex cybersecurity paradox. The same AI capabilities that offer transformative advantages can also create new vulnerabilities, accelerating the speed and impact of cyber threats. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Insight podcast, where we talk about the ever evolving tech space. And I'm your host, Priya Dayalani. Now, many of today's most pressing AI related risks originate internally. These include shadow AI, unsanctioned AI deployments by individual teams that create significant governance blind spots, and autonomous decision making systems interacting with sensitive data. Such deployments represent potential sources of data leakage, model manipulation, or unauthorized access, highlighting the critical need for proactive risk management. Joining us today is Raghuveer Kancherla, co founder of Sprinto, to explore key risks such as shadow AI supply chain vulnerabilities, and governance challenges, followed by how AI can be leveraged to strengthen compliance frameworks. Hi, Raghuveer, how are you doing?
I'm great, Priya. Thanks so much for having me here.
Great. It's a pleasure to have you on our podcast today, Raghuveer. And shadow AI is something that, earlier we had shadow IT, now we have shadow AI. So, how technology is evolving, I think the complexities are also revolving alongside. And of course, we are going to talk much more about it in our episode today. So let's start by, setting the foundation and telling our listeners more about Sprinto, a very interesting name, I must say. So if you could, give a brief about the company, its specialization. We would also like to know more about you, Raghu, your role at the company, and whatever else, you could share so that listeners could get a brief understanding about it.
Absolutely. So, Priya, Sprinto is an autonomous trust platform built for fast-growing companies. For startups, this means we get them compliant with certifications like SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or whatever their customers are asking them, so they can build trust required to get their customers' business. Right. From an enterprise standpoint, this means standing up an enterprise grade end-to-end trust program that provides a single pane of glass for all their obligations, whether it is from their customer contracts. There are contracts customers are signing on like a daily basis, and there are lots of obligations that are baked into them. Sometimes it is regulations like DPDP being the most recent one. Sometimes it is security frameworks like SOC 2 or ISO. And sometimes it's also like industry specific things like HIPAA or PCI DSS and so on, right? So no matter what the source is, we provide like a single pane of glass for all a company's obligations, monitoring their current posture against these obligations and running autonomous workflows to make sure they're meeting these obligations. It can be on their infrastructure, it can be how they manage their vendors, it can be about how they manage their risk, etc. Right? Traditionally, all of this was always managed manually. It was spreadsheet heavy. It sort of slowed down companies of all sizes. In contrast, what we do is we build agents that manages this whole thing for them, right? So I'm one of the co-founders at Sprinto. We are two founders. We are second-time founders, both of us. We built and sold another company before this. Currently, my focus is on making sure at Sprinto, currently my focus is on making sure that trust is accessible to businesses of all sizes. I focus on our strategy to achieve this for our customers, translating it into short-term and mid-term goals and keeping the entire team on track to these goals.
That's incredible, Raghu, and thank you for sharing that. And I really, liked how you have broken down not just what Sprinter does, but also the philosophy behind how it operates. And, it's so important to understand that you are solving a very specific and high impact problem in the industry today. And we are also really glad to know about your journey. And I think that's where, when you have the intent and leadership behind a vision, that's when real transformation begins. Now let's
Yes.
dive a little bit deeper into, a lot of things or debates or skepticism around AI. The wizardry of Chat GPT captured the world's attention when it was released back in 2022. and became the most successful product launch in history. Now, since then, AI companies and startups have attracted billions in new investments, and the technology has continued to dazzle. Consumer facing AI programs can now compose love ballads or fabricate a realistic video of cowboys riding unicorns and shooting water pistols from simple text prompts. So navigating the paradox of responsibility as well as disruption will require leadership, new skills, and even transparency about the sources and uses of AI. Now, a lot of people are talking about AI for AI. So, why are we talking about it now, like in this current scenario, and what does that exactly mean?
Yeah. Great question there, Priya. Just to go back into the history a little bit and talk about my own experiences on this front. See, I've been building companies for a couple of decades now. Like I've said before, that there's another company before this we built and sold. I think there have been several waves of AI before, but they've all faded away. AI has had some impact, but most of it turned out to be not so real, right? But this time around, I feel AI is very real, even within our own operations, the way I'm seeing the world change around us. You're also calling out a bunch of these things, the kind of capabilities that AI is bringing. I think it's very real and its adoption is skyrocketing. And I also think at some level, anyone who doesn't adopt will also get left behind, whether it's companies or individuals, right? But more adoption also means more data security risks, right? Employees are using generative AI tools daily, right? Companies are embedding AI into their products. Internal agents are making decisions, the triggering workflows and interacting with sensitive data. The scale of adoption is moving much faster than the scale of oversight, right? And that's where it's important for us to recognize that the old ways of governing our data will no longer work, right? This is where we need to use AI to govern AI. Traditional governance generally assumes systems are predictable, mostly static, change very slowly. It was enough to govern periodically, right? Like it was very common for people to do like a vendor risk assessment once a year. But I don't think it works anymore. And as businesses are becoming more and more dynamic with AI, usage and adoption are also shifting in days, right? Like new tools are cropping up almost on a daily basis, and you just cannot manage these things in an episodic or a periodic manner, right? So AI for AI means using intelligent continuous ways to monitor, evaluate and govern other AI systems, which is near real time, right? In simple terms, when machines start making decisions, you need machines that can keep up with these machines, right? So that the guardrails are also moving at the same pace at which the technology is moving.
That's pretty insightful, Raghu. And, I think it is so important to understand this AI for AI and understand that, it feels like we are watching the industrialization of intelligence itself. Because earlier we needed teams of engineers to manually tune models or pipelines or monitor the performance metrics and then accordingly patch vulnerabilities. But
Yeah.
today, with AI again coming into the picture, it's kind of helping itself improve its own architecture and order decision making and predict failure because before they even occur. So I think that's pretty fascinating at this moment to understand this AI for AI and ensure that we are doing it appropriately. Great.
Yeah.
And earlier in my introduction, we discussed about shadow AI.
Correct.
Now, a lot of companies or employees, have this question that are your employees feeding your company sensitive code into a public chatbot? You might have a handle on who is installing unauthorized software, but with the
Mhm.
rise of generative AI, it has introduced a more subtler and a more dangerous variant of an old problem. So,
Yeah.
like discussed, shadow IT has plagued system administrators for decades. It
Yes.
typically involves employees downloading unapproved software or signing up for a SaaS application without the IT team coming into the knowledge. While frustrating, traditional shadow IT has often been about, productivity. Now we have shadow AI, which kind of represents a significant escalation of the risk that I discussed about shadow IT. So, how is this shadow IT different from shadow IT and why it is potentially more dangerous?
Yeah, again, once again, great question there, Priya. I think at some level, from a shadow IT perspective, the important part was if something was being used, it was easy to, at least once you figure out that it is being used, teams could go after figuring out what they need to do about it. But today, the acceleration of tools that are using AI in the background has gone up quite a bit, right? But even in order to, first of all, call the difference between what shadow IT and shadow AI are, maybe we should start there. For a long time, I think shadow IT was about unapproved tools, right? AI is actually about unapproved intelligence acting on your data. Today, AI tools are growing bottom up, and many have freemium models, right? Which means key adoption does not start with procurement, right? It starts with an employee trying to move faster. And what's really happening is because there is so much of adoption of AI via ChatGPT, everybody knows that AI can make things faster, better for them. And people are trying new tools almost on a daily basis. Right. Just imagine somebody preparing like a business review deck, right? And they take customer data, paste it into a like presentation making tool like either a Gamma or a GenSpark or something like that, and generate polished slides in minutes and move on, right? From their perspective, they save time, and none of this comes from bad intent. However, from a governance perspective, you've actually compromised sensitive customer data, which left the organization without any visibility, right? So this is shadow AI, and these kind of tools are cropping up on a daily basis. And the point about many of these AI systems is that they're not just storing this information, they're generating outputs, infer patterns, and sometimes act on behalf of users also, right? And this can actually create like a completely different kind of opening as far as security risks are concerned. And the risk is more dynamic and harder to see.
A very well distinction portrayed by you, Raghu. And I think what makes shadow IT also more dangerous is that with what you said, it doesn't just sit in the background. It is actively generating content and making decisions, analyzing data, and even in some
Yes,
cases, influencing strategy. So I
yes.
think employees, with what you said, they aren't just using these tools, they are kind of outsourcing their thinking or documentation or even their work and to
Yeah.
systems that may not be very well secured or compliant in that matter.
Yes, sometimes even the actions from the insights are taken by AI, and
Yeah.
that can actually pose further threats as well.
Very true, very true. And I think that, brings us to the other aspect of AI is that, AI systems, they typically depend on various components. So, and majorly it is from third-party sources. We have software libraries or pre-trained models or APIs and hardware. So these dependencies can introduce supply chain risks and they can undermine security, reliability, and even the functionality of the system. So, of course, effectively managing these risks is very important for any organization that is intending to deploy a particular AI system to solve a particular use case. So, how do you think with so much of AI adoption, everybody talking about AI today, how vulnerable is the AI supply chain today?
Yeah, but again, an interesting question. I think most organizations are more vulnerable than they realize. But the interesting thing here, Priya, is, before AI supply chain risks were real, there was a problem around software supply chains as well. And there was a lot of work happening in that space. And AI supply chain is not very different from that. When companies adopt AI, they often think they may be adopting a single tool or model. But in reality, they're plugging into an ecosystem, right? A foundational model built by one company, different inferences routed to different models, data tagging is done by other companies, right? Sometimes your data is used for training, sometimes it's not. It depends on your license. There are a lot of, so in essence, what is really happening here is there are vendors behind vendors, right? Each layer is adding dependency and risks. And the challenge is that these systems can change quietly, right? A provider can update a model, an API can behave differently, a vendor can switch components in the background, and AI can decide to use new tools like the browser at its discretion, because all these tools are now becoming accessible to many of these agents. And those changes can affect how your system responds, what it outputs, what agents get access to, and how it handles data, right? Unlike traditional software, AI does not always behave in a fixed way. Its output can shift based on the updates, the context you give, even what the user is asking when they are using the AI system itself can basically make a large impact to its what it does, right? This makes oversight very complex, and when you depend on layers you cannot see, exposure grows whether it is visible to you or not.
Very well said, Raghu. And I think when we talk about AI revolution, we often focus on model accuracy or its performance or benchmarks. But what often gets overlooked is the invisible web of dependencies underneath, just like we discussed. And I think what makes this even more critical is the fact that many organizations do not have full visibility into every layer of their AI stack. And in some
Yeah.
cases, teams are building on top of the tools they didn't create. So, which are not even fully audited, or you cannot even entirely
Yes.
control it. So I think there's a lot of going into the picture, and it's important that we focus on the governance and management related aspects also in terms of introducing these AI models.
Yes.
Great. So for now, I think we have discussed, how these AI systems are growing and what are certain of the risks that, that usually crop up. Now, since AI systems do not understand the tasks they perform and they rely on the training data basically, so they are far from infallible. The reliability of their outcomes can be jeopardized if the input data is biased, incomplete, or even of poor quality. So then you have various issues. You will have programmatic errors. So, where error exists, algorithms may not perform as expected and may deliver misleading results that have serious consequences. So, my next question is, if AI introduces new risks, how can AI itself be used to tackle these new risks or detect anomalies or even enforce policy controls?
Yeah, I think we touched upon this briefly in the beginning of the conversation, Priya, but I think the important point is when AI is moving things as fast, the important thing for us to do is to ensure that the governance and the guardrails around what you're building with AI is also moving just as fast, right? And that can only happen with AI by itself. And this was, if you really think about it, it's just ensuring that you're using the new technology to guardrail it well as well, right? And if you think deeply about this part of it, the velocity with which things are moving, you can no longer govern these systems manually at all, right? It needs to become autonomous, and you have AI doing work autonomously and AI governing the work being done as well. And that core idea is simple, right? For example, I'm going to now talk about it in the context of what we do, but there are many examples here. But to pick up specific examples from the domain of governance, right? Instead of waiting for annual audits to discover gaps, AI systems can now scan environments in real time, right? They can detect obligations that are not being met. Let's say for a specific customer, you promise like a 99.9% uptime guarantee, right? But your internal systems are only at a 99% uptime guarantee. These things can be now figured out real time, right? And that shifts governance from reactive to becoming more proactive, right? And the second important thing that AI unlocks really is that if you really see, AI unlocks personalization at scale. Essentially, all regulatory frameworks and legal obligations and customer contracts are all of these, end of day, they are like one way or another standardized set of things that a regulator wants a company to follow. However, they need to be interpreted in, and applied in the context of a company. Every company operates differently. This was tedious, required hundreds of hours of work, and very few people in the industry could do it. However, now AI can interpret and personalize these obligations on a company in the company's context at scale. This makes it easier and accessible for all companies to adhere to these standards and legal obligations they need to with ease, right? Like, so the point is, AI makes a lot of this governance also possible. So I think if we adopt it the right way, it will enable all of us to move and adopt AI and get to the next level of evolution on this with confidence.
Definitely, Raghu, you made a very important point there. And, I think in many ways we are entering an era where AI systems will supervise the other AI systems. and it's creating a kind of layered defense model. And what's more exciting here is that we are shifting from a reactive compliance to proactive intelligence, where risks can be identified before they escalate and controls evolve dynamically rather than remaining just static checkboxes.
Yes.
Great. So, of course, we have discussed about the governance, the guardrails, and all the different aspects, along with the risks that we usually face in terms of deploying AI models. Now, I think with the widespread and rapid diffusion of AI in all types of organizational activities, I think it's kind of necessitating the ethical and responsible deployment of these technologies. Various national and international policies, regulations, and guidelines, they aim to address this issue. And even we are, leaders like you are guiding organizations to ensure that compliance and governance is not something like an afterthought now. It should be there right from the beginning. So, what capabilities will define organizations that successfully secure and govern AI ecosystems over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, maybe I'll call out a couple of these. The first one, in my view, Priya, is you now need to. We talked enough about this part of it in the previous part of the conversation, but I want to summarize it here. It's important that in order to govern AI, it's important to become continuous, right? If you need to trust this technology, it can't be point in time. AI systems change, models update, vendors modify components, and things evolve, right? So the companies that succeed will move from, these periodic model of oversight to something that is continuous, right? Second, I feel overall it will become more autonomous. You cannot be making decisions and govern manually in a world where decisions are being made by AI of its own, right? So you will need autonomous governance also, right? You need to make decisions and govern things just at the speed at which business is moving, right? The third point is it's important to create some level of explainability, because I think that is also growing. There's a growing voice for it overall. EU AI Act, for example, is setting clear expectations around this portion of it. So it's important to create the right kind of audit logs. Why was a certain decision taken, and who approved this kind of a decision, and so on, right? So these are the three main things I feel will define a company's capability to adopt AI confidently.
Great, Raghu. Thank you for sharing those crisp capabilities and helping our listeners gain an understanding of it. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, the winners won't simply be the ones with the most sophisticated models, but the ones with the strongest governance foundations. And I think what you have highlighted is very critical, that governance frameworks and compliance policies must evolve as fast as the technology itself, because static policies won't survive in a dynamic AI environment. And like you mentioned, continuous monitoring, we also need model validation, supply chain scrutiny, and ethical oversight. All of this will also define a new benchmark for maturity. Great.
Yeah.
So I think overall AI is something that is going to stay. Until recently, most AI systems were reactive. They analyzed and took decisions based on past data. But now we have systems that can, talk to you, and they are ensuring predictive analytics. And, we are in an era of proactive AI. So, what is one mindset that you would give to leaders who want to adopt and move from reactive AI governance to a more proactive AI resilience?
Yeah, great question. See, I feel we should stop thinking about governance as a control mechanism, right? Like governance has been a control mechanism for a really long time, but I think it's important to start thinking of it as infrastructure that provides the visibility and trust necessary for leaders to adopt AI confidently, right? Typically, this is about, there's one way to think about it where you say, how do we adopt this without increasing our exposure, and what are the controls I need to have in place? The other way to think about it is, how do we build systems that let us move fast without losing, the trust in the decisions that are being made? Right. Essentially, we can't necessarily slow down AI adoption. I think at an employee level, product level, vendor level, everybody is adopting it. Everybody knows that this is going to change their lives. The most important mindset shift that we need is that we need to start building the infrastructure necessary for adopting AI with confidence.
Definitely. And I think when organizations start their journey from reactive to proactive AI, that will mark a profound evolution in enterprise intelligence. And it's not just about being faster, it's about being smarter, anticipatory, and resilient. Forward thinking organizations are already investing in infrastructure, talent, and governance to make proactive AI central to their strategy. Thank you so much, Raghu, for taking out the time and effort to be on our podcast today and, helping us understand that trust will be a key to responsible adoption of AI and bridging the gap between a transformative journey and its human users. And as AI becomes more autonomous and intuitive, enterprises that embrace proactive intelligence will innovate faster, serve customers better, and navigate uncertainty with confidence. Thank you so much for your insights. It was lovely chatting with you, Raghu.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So, this is for our listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion around the risks around AI, what is something enterprises need to do, and why proactive AI is not just a trend, but it's a strategic necessity moving forward. Stay tuned for our upcoming podcasts, and you can view all our previous episodes on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.